The University of Santo Tomas in the heart of Manila, Philippines, is one of the top private comprehensive universities in the country and is Asia's only pontifical institution. UST, the Catholic University of the Philippines, enjoys local and international repute. With over 4 centuries of experience in delivering quality Catholic education, adapting to the times and surmounting obstacles are not new to UST, and the worst crisis of our time is no exception.
Abot 170 katao ang binabantayan ng Department of Health.
The Health Department has raised Code Red Sub-Level 1 alert over the coronavirus disease or COVID-19.
Not one to be overpowered by storms and headwinds, the University of Santo Tomas faced the challenge of flexible and responsive management head-on, with the enriched virtual mode of instruction powered by the UST Cloud Campus. Building on 18 years of experience in massive-wide e-learning adoption, the enriched virtual mode of instruction was adopted in response to the quick shift to fully online instruction. Since March 9, 2020, the EVM has helped ensure the continuity of quality Catholic education to over 40,000 plus students during our generation's most perilous period. Our pandemic story is one of vigilance, cooperation, care, and grace. Even before the lockdown, we addressed one important question. What happens when the campus closes? The answer was found in the university's institutional continuity plan for teaching and learning, which highlighted the use of a vital resource, the UST Cloud Campus. What was hoped to be a temporary disruption, however, morphed into the new normal, which we now navigate with the guidance from the principles of dialogue, accessibility, and flexibility in learning. The EVM harnesses the shared desire of staff and students to succeed, the technological resources available, and the innate abilities and talents of all. All courses, including laboratory, skills-based, and internship courses, fully transition to online means with provisions for offline means as needed, showcasing the mettle of faculty experts who devised alternative means to impart knowledge, skills, and values from a distance. Complementing the expertise of the Mashan academic staff who work collaboratively to teach learners were the enrichments to instruction in the form of remote encounters with community partners, collaborative learning opportunities with foreign partner institutions, and interactions with industry partners and alumni. Collectively, these interventions led to a common goal, the formation of the Mashans, who embody our core values and are stamped with the seal of the Mashan education. The uncertainties caused by lockdowns that seemingly had no end in sight beg the question, can we do this? As the past year has shown, we can, we have. The period of transition was a testament to the ability of stakeholders to rise above the situation and continue teaching and learning within the resources available. The question of what now was answered through the cooperation of all. A pre-existing university-wide faculty training initiative, a university mandate to utilize blended learning even before the pandemic, the near 2-decade e-learning expertise of the Educational Technology Center, the establishment of the Center for Innovative Teaching and Educational Delivery, and the availability of digital learning tools and resources, to name a few, were UST's buttress against the question on resources. These resources found their way out of España, reaching Thomasians all over the country and abroad. A university-level committee, the Task Force Veritas, conducted a university-wide assessment of the readiness to shift to virtual operations, helping harmonize the efforts of all academic and support units. The Office of the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs, together with the heads of the university's 22 degree-granting academic units, led the swift transition to remote teaching and learning through collaborative policy and program development, implementation, evaluation, and continuous improvement. Giving life to the support system to address educational needs are the Educational Technology Center, the country's pioneer in massive e-learning adoption, and the Miguel de Benavides Library, whose core of specialists and support personnel collectively ensure the delivery of academic or technical support services to faculty and students. Vital technological infrastructure were upgraded to meet the demands of running a university beyond the four walls of the campus. This led to the transition of full virtual delivery of services, attending to stakeholders' health, wellness, and spiritual needs. Care is the driving force behind the EVM's continued enhancement, made possible through the intensification of existing communication channels with students at the university, academic unit, program, and classroom levels. Through continued dialogue with students and staff, UST has been able to make data-driven decisions on how to move forward in balancing the concerns of quality education and wellness. Instructional delivery factors in the technological capacity and internet connectivity of learners provided a framework to classify strategies and materials. Regular review and adjustment of course plans prioritize learning outcomes and content, resulting in realistic educational delivery that factors in the achievement of outcomes and management of workload. More than a year since EVM began, the university has proven that with the right blend of people, principles, process, and product, even the gargantuan task of shifting over 43,000 people to a new mode of educational delivery is possible. Tested through the stringent external review by international and local agencies, the EVM has shown its viability and success to continue delivering the Thomasian brand of education. This brand of education is what our pandemic classes bring with them into the world outside Sampaloc. A brand of education that is competent, compassionate, and committed. A brand of education given to the children of unending grace.
Good morning to all our viewers and welcome to the 11th webinar of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History. I am Robert John Donesa, a faculty member of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History, who will serve as your host for this event. Master of Ceremonies for today. Before anything else, let us have first the invocation to be led by Father Gerard Francisco P. Timoner III, Master of the Order of Preachers, to be followed by the Philippine National Anthem.
Dear brothers and sisters, I invite you to pray with me the 13th century Dominican blessing. Let us all be aware of God's abiding presence in our midst. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. May God the Father bless us. May God the Son heal us. May God the Holy Spirit enlighten us and give us eyes to see with, ears to hear with, hands to do the work of God with, feet to walk with, and mouth to preach the word of salvation with. And may the angel of peace to watch over us and lead us at last by our Lord's gift to the kingdom. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
To formally open our webinar this morning, allow me to call the chair of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History, Dr. Archie B. Resos. Dr. Resos, sir.
Yes, good morning, Attorney Donesa. Thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning to all our viewers. It is with honor that I welcome you to the UST Department of History's 11th webinar with the topic Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia, State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. This webinar will be delivered by Professor Rommel Curaming, Senior Assistant Professor of History and International Studies Program of the Universiti Brunei Darussalam and a fellow alumnus of the University of the Philippines Asian Center in UP Diliman. Among scholars in Southeast Asia, relationship between the Filipinos and the people of Southeast Asia has been bolstered with its long-standing history and the movement of people from island to island, which is strengthened by trade, commerce, cultural exchanges, and the propensity to fight a common Western colonial domination in the region. With this commonality of the peoples of Southeast Asia, it is noticeable that the dynamic relationship between the powerful, the elites, the wealthy class, would interact with those carrying viable knowledge in history. Both of this has been conspicuous in Indonesia and in the Philippines, and both countries have been dominated by nationalists and progressive politics that are centered mostly around the fulcrums of wealth and power. As the knowledge about history in the Philippines and Indonesia has been dominated by the Oriental and Western divisions, colonial and anti-colonial mentalities, these kinds of knowledge precipitates the minds of most scholars as it trickles down to the learners of history. However, we have to mention that knowledge is always driven by power. It is quite observable that the concept of intellectual prostitution has emerged in the mindset of some scholars. This is to say that repressive government manipulation can have adverse effects in the historical orientation of the students of history. As an official of the Department of Education and chairperson of the UST Department of History, we will prevent such unscholarly undertakings and instead focus on the importance of good scholarship. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Curaming, for being our main speaker for today's webinar, and I hope we will have greater insights regarding truthfulness of scholars in history. May God bless us all, and good day to everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Resos, for that insightful remarks. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us a resource speaker who will be discussing the important and the salient details of his book entitled Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. Let me introduce to you our resource speaker this morning. Our guest speaker is the program leader or the chair and a senior assistant professor at the Department of History and International Studies program of the University Brunei Darussalam. He completed PhD in Southeast Asian Studies at the Australian National University and also obtained Master of Arts degrees in Asian Studies from the University of Singapore and the University of the Philippines in Diliman, and a Bachelor of Secondary Education also from the University of the Philippines in Diliman. Before joining University Brunei Darussalam, he was a postdoctoral fellow at La Trobe University and National University of Singapore. The empirical and thematic areas of his research vary, like comparative historiography, state scholar relations, intellectual history, history and memory of political violence, textbook analysis, heritage making, and identity politics. But they cohere around the analysis of politics of the non-political, as evident in knowledge production and consumption in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines. He published in journals such as Critical Asian Studies, Southeast Asia Research, Time and Society, Philippine Studies, Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, Sojourn Critica Cultura, and the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, among many others. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker for this morning, please welcome Dr. Rommel A. Curaming.
Thank you very much, Attorney Danessa, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I would like first to thank the History Department under the leadership of Dr. Archie Resos, and also, Emmanuel, Jarek, for facilitating this webinar this morning. It's my pleasure to be here. I cherish the opportunity to share with you some ideas that I developed in my book, which I'm going to start discussing in a while. So I also would like to thank everyone, those who are in remote places, in various places, wherever you may be. Thank you for taking time to be with us this morning. So the title of the book, my book that was published 2020, by Routledge is Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia, State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. So let me give you first a rundown of the book. So as shown on the screen, we have here the table of content. So the first chapter, I look into the theoretical discussion of the relationship between power and knowledge. In the second chapter of the book, I provide a contextual comparison. What was happening in Indonesia and the Philippines in the period that concerned the empirical focus of this book. So that's basically the Marcos years from the 1960s all the way to 1980s, and Suharto from the 1960s all the way up to beyond 1998. So in the third chapter, I come up with a narrative. I tell a story here of how the Tadhana project came about. The fourth chapter, I look into the political context as well as the historiographic context that allows this project to be understood. The following chapter, chapter 5, I look into the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. So this is the comparable project that I also analyze in this book. So I will say a bit about this in the presentation today, but I will primarily be focusing on the Tadhana project because these are two very complicated books, and these are very complicated projects, and they demonstrate the complexity of the relationship between power and knowledge, and it will require a lot of time to discuss this. So I might as well just leave it on the sideline for now. So chapter 6 is it focuses on the contents and the context of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. Chapter 7 is the comparative chapter here, where I analyze the relationship. I try to highlight key issues, key themes, as well as the illustration of those issues to demonstrate the interconnectedness, the different ways by which power and knowledge relation interact. Finally, that kind of conclusion. Okay, so in this book, I try to compare these two projects. Tadhana project that was spearheaded, that was led, sponsored by former President Ferdinand Marcos. It's I compare this with the one in Indonesia that was also the case under Suharto, under Suharto's regime. So these two projects are very comparable in many ways, and they promise if you read my book, you'd see that these two projects are equally fascinating in many ways, insofar as if we would like to understand the very complex relationship between power and knowledge. So I'll focus in this presentation on Tadhana. It's a very ambitious project. The idea is to produce 21 volumes of supposedly, the aspiration is to come up with a very comprehensive history that will cover from the Big Bang all the way to the formation of the Philippine archipelago, the formation of the Philippine Adam, the formation of the Philippine state, the colonial period, all the way up to 1970s, the birth of the new society. So this started around 1973-74 and lasted until 1986. It was not, by 1986, when it was swept away by the EDSA revolution, it was not yet complete. So only 5 volumes of the projected 21 volumes came out by then. But actually, the volumes had been drafted already, and second abridged version, the volume 2 of the abridged version was supposed to come out in soon when revolution swept the entire project away. So it was funded by Marcos, and it's supposed to be a secret kind of project. It was participated in by some of the most capable young UP scholars. And that's one of the reasons why it was a very controversial project. Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, just to give you an idea, quite a bit, it's also it's also an ambitious project. It was considered as an ambitious project during the time that it started. The scholars in Indonesia, the historians in Indonesia, were very hesitant to undertake this project because they knew that the time was not yet ripe to undertake this kind of project. They believe that the historical profession is still lacking in enough people, enough expertise in order to undertake this project. But nevertheless, they were egged on, they were pushed, encouraged, strongly encouraged by the government to do this, and they did. Within 4 or 5 years, they managed, it's quite an accomplishment. They managed to publish the project. By 1975, late 1975, the first edition came out. So unlike Tadhana that did not get completed, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia was completed. And the idea here, it's supposed to, just like in Tadhana, it's practically all the best scholars, historians and other scholars in Indonesia that has to do with the writing of history and culture had participated in this project. And in the beginning, it was welcomed as something to look forward to. But when it finally was completed and it was published, it was then when the controversies erupted. So it's it's a fascinating story of how this project came about. And if you are interested to take a look, to read it, you can download my book through the website that Jerick would share the link via that website. So okay, so I'm going to say a bit more about Sejarah Nasional Indonesia when I do the comparison in a while towards the middle and end of my presentation. But for now, I'd like to focus on Tadhana project. Okay, so the first documented declaration made by Marcos about his desire to write history, that happened in in a conference before the Philippine Historical Association conference in 1967. He said that he longed for the day to be able to write history, and that he said that it might happen once his stint in politics is over. But it turned out that he didn't have to wait that long. Sometime in 1968, there was this kind of idea floated within certain groups of historians to establish some kind of commission to rewrite Philippine history. So by that time, there were a lot of talks about the problems of how colonial minded, how Eurocentric our history is, and there is a need for much more vigorous Filipino viewpoint or perspective in writing history. And so this idea circulated within the group of scholars or historians to come up with a commission to rewrite Philippine history. Marcos and Imelda had this idea that to invite Agoncillo, Teodoro Agoncillo, and Horacio de la Costa to spearhead this commission. But so it was Imelda who talked to them, and on both instances, they declined. Agoncillo and de la Costa declined. Agoncillo specifically recalled that he tried very hard to come up with a very polite excuse to avoid this project, not to be involved in this project. And he was worried that once he did that, then he'll be considered as some kind of prostitute. So he politely declined the offer. Apparently, initially Imelda got the message, and so it was no longer pursued. However, some documentary evidence point that as late as 1973, they were still asked. The last time they were asked about this, sometime in 1973, and you can see the perseverance on the part of the Marcoses to get these two people involved. Sometime in 1971 to probably most likely, 72, 73, there was this project called the Philippine Heritage. So if you take a look on the screen, these 10 volumes, Philippine Heritage, 10 volumes of this project, very nice book, glossy, a lot of pictures, articles that were well written by experts on the field. So the idea for this Philippine Heritage Project was originally, the idea for here was to serialize it and publish in Manila Times. But when martial law was declared in 1972, it was shelved. And so they thought of having a multi-volume kind of project. And because they wanted the Department of Education to get some kind of endorsement for use in public schools, they had to seek the approval coming from Malacanang. And it so happened that the head of this project, Alfredo Roses, he was mistaken by Marcos to be the Roses that he hated, and so it was it didn't go well, and but Marcos had the idea of taking over this project. So And I'll say a bit more about this in a while. But he had this kind of interest to have this kind of project, and they were asked to submit all the drafts of the write-ups for review. And this group of UP scholars did a review of the work. And this group, including in this group are well, let me move to the next. Wait. Including in this group were scholars like Samuel Tan, Sue Salazar, Serafin Quezon. Rod Paras Perez would join later. So they're the ones who did the review of the Philippine heritage, and they turned in a negative review of the Philippine heritage. So with the negative review, what followed that was Marcos abandoned the idea of taking over the Philippine heritage. The plan was for him to be the editor-in-chief of the Philippine Heritage Project. But it did not, probably because of the review, they opted not to do that. And besides, the Australian group that funded this project, they don't like the idea that they will be taken over by Marcos. So they refuse that kind of idea, and with the negative review turned in by the UP scholars, the idea of taking over Philippine heritage was abandoned by Marcos, and that was the start of the Tadhana project. So an altogether a new project was conceived starting 1973, 1974. Okay, so what are the motivations of Marcos in having this kind of project? The most common idea is justification for martial law and manipulation of history for personal gains. There is evidently element of this, but we have to pay more attention as well to other complicating reasons. Because if the idea is just to justify martial law and to manipulate history for personal gains, why choose, for example, why did Marcos want to invite Agoncillo or De La Costa or both of them to head the project? These two people were the Marcoses knew were difficult to manipulate. So why promise them this kind of free reign in the project? If we take a look at the interest of Marcos in writing history, we're going to see this in the evolutionary stages. Initially, what he wanted was just to sponsor a commission to write history. And that's the reason why they kept on trying to invite Agoncillo and De La Costa. It evolved into this idea of taking over Philippine heritage as editor-in-chief. And finally, he wanted not just to be a sponsor or editor, but the author of Tadhana, 21 volumes. So you would see that kind of transformation of the desire, the plan to do it. So there must be some kind of other factors to consider here. One thing is that Marcos is a leader who believed in the usefulness of history for policymaking. And those participants I interviewed for this book, they attested to the fact that they had to do a lot of research about so many things. So whenever Marcos would go to other places, to China, for example, or to Europe, they would do some research that will um, that will be very useful in formulating the kind of policies, the kind of moves, the kind of plans that they would do vis-a-vis those particular countries. There's also this element of self-glorification here. He wanted to be known as a scholarly president, and one of the participant mentioned that actually most of the initial copies of the books, the first prints, were allotted to giving out to embassy people, to all the people outside of the country. Anyone, wherever they went, wherever they went, they give out this book. So that's the idea is, yeah, he, and you can also see that in his diary. Marcos was elated. For example, there are entries in his diary when Marcos was he wrote there, "Oh, a lot of people are talking about my book," so that kind of thing. So he was gratified by having his name recognized as the author. Another important factor is, yeah, he has a deep interest in history. He reads a lot, and the participants in the project with PhDs in history, they attest to how well read Marcos is in history. So aside from that kind of deep interest is the fear of history. Marcos is fearful of of how history will judge him. In the in this I took this from Marcos' diary, October 8th. He was said here that he wrote here, "I often wonder what I will be remembered in history for. Scholar, military hero, builder, the new constitution, reorganization of the government, uniter, or whatever, this kind of thing." So he had this idea. He's bothered by how he will be judged in or by history. And also, he had this kind of distrust of historians. And in one of the passages in his diary, again, he indicated history is too important to be left to the historians. So you'd see that kind of mixture, ambivalent attitude, interest, and at the same time fear of history, and also that kind of distrust of historians. Now, among scholars, what are the motivations of scholars in doing this? It's the common perception as well is, magkano ang dahilan. Okay, so the money matters. That's one of the most common things that you can hear from, particularly from those groups who are not sympathetic to these scholars. They talking about how much money they got from the project. So actually, this to what extent money was important, it depends on the situation in life of particular participants. For younger PhD students, master students, for example, and those who are freshly minted PhD just starting a career, they readily admitted that the top up, the additional in comparison with the UP salary was quite significant. Okay, so but the more senior members, it also depends. There's one member of this among the senior ones who can afford to be very cavalier when it comes to this, because in the first place he's a well-known artist and he has quite well off, so he didn't really mind about the money. He was joking that his secretary sold him off very cheaply when he was asked how much how much salary do you like to receive. So, but others, they also are very yeah, they don't like to talk about it. They said that it's very minimal. The difference is very minimal compared to UP salary, and they told me that they had other reasons for joining this. And what are some of these other reasons? Research opportunities. Okay, so this project provided them opportunities to visit archives overseas. It provides a lot of resources. They were not given. They were not no glass ceiling was set insofar as the amount of money they needed for acquiring materials. So long as they are necessary in archives in the UK, in the US, in Europe, for example, so long as they needed, the cost should not be a problem. So it provided an ideal working environment, which a lot of them didn't really experience. So they had typists, for example. They don't have to type, which was during the time was really a big thing. So you draft, you write, you draft it, and then you give it to the typist, and in the afternoon you get the manuscript. So it was that memorable for them. Also, this opportunity to realize historiographic vision. This particularly applies to the two main designer of the project, Samuel Tan and Sue Salazar. Samuel Tan and Sue Salazar, they already have a very clear-cut idea of what kind of history they would like to write. So they had this kind of well-developed historiographic vision that can only be realized with the support of a project like this. They cannot hope to do that just by being an ordinary professor at UP with all the administrative and teaching responsibilities. So here's the opportunity for you. All you do is do research and write, and that would last for a number of years. So it's really a very attractive. It was a very attractive proposition when they were offered, when they first heard about the project. Another important point that arose during the interview is the nationalist packaging of the project. It was presented as a nationalist undertaking, as an opportunity to write a truly, quote unquote, truly nationalist history, the kind of history that will address many of the problems in Philippine history. They were also promised this kind of freedom. Okay, one thing that was promised, given by Marcos, was that kind of freedom to do what they like, and so that was also a come on. Okay, so when we have this kind of project, like Tadhana Project and Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, they are official histories. They are histories that were sponsored by the government or by the dictator. And it's common that when we are face to face with this kind of case, it's common for us to have this kind of idea that the scholars are manipulated or co-opted, and that the history they write is distorted. It's some kind of propaganda because it was an unofficial history. And they were given this kind of labels like intellectual prostitutes, academic mercenaries. They were co-opted, they were sell-off, or they were tutak ni Makoy. So this kind of idea, the presumption, there is this kind of presumption of the ideal that scholar is supposed to be impartial, They're supposed to be intellectuals, supposed to be public intellectuals who speak truth to power. So in this conventional view, there is this kind of opposition between scholarship and politics. And it's just a matter of getting things right empirically, methodologically, theoretically, to neutralize politics. So this idea that if you're a good scholar, you must be able to transcend, to go beyond, or to neutralize politics. If you are empirically grounded, you have the basis, you have the methods, the right methods, and the right theory, then that is the way for you to neutralize politics. And that's the reason why fact checking is the main usual solution. So we fact check, supposedly, those things that were considered as fake news or distorted views. And this idea, some scholars would call it the liberal view of the the scholarship politics relations. In my book, I acknowledge the fact that this kind of view, there are a lot of things in these two projects that fit within that view. But my book goes beyond that. And this is the first takeaway that I would like to discuss with you today. The first takeaway, and based on my analysis of the two projects, yes, indeed, there are elements in the project that support the conventional view. For example, it's true that Marcos promised this kind of freedom. And most of what they have written, Marcos didn't really manipulate them. They didn't say what to write, okay? Only on certain occasions, particularly in relation to the chapters directly related to Marcos' period, so 1966 onward. Beyond that, other than that, hardly, yeah. In the case of the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, SNI, it's very replete with biases against Sukarno, against the old order, against the Communist Party. So you easily see those kind of biases. And in other words, they are not called official histories for nothing. But I think one of the main contribution of my book is to go beyond this conventional idea of the politics scholarship relation. Okay, so I argue in the book that the oppositional relationship between scholarship and politics is only one of the possibilities. There are many instances that they are complementary. They need each other. There are instances when they run parallel or unrelated. Scholars do things the way they want to do as scholars, and the government didn't pay attention to that. So there are also elements of that. At the most is that kind of relationship that is very closely intertwined, that they mutually constitute each other. So this is the kind of relationship that is most fascinating to look at, and also not easy to do. But the point that I tried to show in the book is the conventional. If you're going to stop using the conventional view, you will be missing a lot. There are many important things that you will miss if you just rely on the conventional view. So the oppositional, I also demonstrate in the book that the oppositional relationship between scholarship and politics is emphasized while the other possibilities are downplayed because it serves the interest of the scholarly class. So the tendency of scholars is to highlight that kind of opposition, supposed opposition, and play coy about the other possible possibilities, because it serves the interest of the scholarly class. It is in the interest of this class to be seen as disinterested, as neutralizer of political interest. So that's one major takeaway, that a main idea that I developed in the book. Next, okay, the next is that the idea, we normally have this idea that if scholarship is strong, it will neutralize politics. If they did not manage to neutralize politics or go against politics, that means they are weak. This kind of idea is quite common in reference to Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. So in Indonesia, for example, after the collapse of the Suharto regime in 1998, and that was the opportunity for them to analyze what happened to Indonesian historiography. One of the main things that was discussed is how weak the historical profession has been, because the Suharto regime managed to manipulate, to engineer, to manipulate, to distort history, and that distortion was very glaring. So the idea is, historical profession or scholarship was weak. But one thing I noticed in the two cases when I compared the two projects, it doesn't necessarily follow. Okay, the weakness of scholarship does not necessarily mean susceptibility to political manipulation. And I demonstrate this point using the case of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. Despite the weakness of the SNI in scholarly terms, it managed to set the limits to political interests. That I show there that the implementation of particular approach, this multidimensional approach, it may have been poorly carried out in the project, but it set the limit to what was achievable. Okay, to what the government eventually achieved. So despite the weaknesses, the limitations in scholarship, it managed to do that. On the other hand, Tadhana is different. Tadhana, the reason why Marcos, okay, wanted the service of these brilliant UP scholars was precisely because he was aiming for a very strong scholarship. Okay, the strength of, if you compare professionalization of Filipino historians and those in Indonesia by 1970s, Filipino historians were well ahead. Okay, were well ahead by 1970s. And yet, okay, despite the strength of scholarship, Tadhana demonstrate that it doesn't follow that if the scholarship is strong, therefore it would neutralize politics. And the reason in the case of Tadhana is precisely that's what Marcos wanted. Marcos wanted a very strong scholarship so that his political interest could be served. So that's another important takeaway, main idea I developed in my book. So let me explain a bit further. What's the idea behind the strong scholarship as the Marcos wanted a very rigorously researched history because he wanted it to be able to stand the test of time, that kind of critical scrutiny. Marcos could have easily just gotten any historian. There were this kind of pool of historians that are normally being used, for example, by the military, for instance, and they could have easily taken them as the one who will write this. But Marcos didn't like that. initially he liked Agoncillo and De La Costa, two of the best historians we had. Okay, so you see, the choice of scholars is precisely the very strong scholarship he was aiming for. And Marcos was aiming for a strong scholarship because he knew very well that Tadhana wouldn't be taken seriously by the people during that time. He knew he was unpopular, very unpopular, and he knew that Tadhana would be easily trashed. Okay, so he was setting his eyes on the future. He was setting his eyes on the future. He wanted history that will be critically able to stand the test of time, because he was setting his eyes on the future when people he believed would no longer, than 100 years from then, for example, 50, 100 years later, you would have a generations who are in his mind would be better able to judge himself and the project fairly. Okay, because he was banking on the hope that future generation would would no longer be affected by the biases against him during the time, and they will be in the better position to judge. So the kind of history he needed was a very good history that will be able to stand that kind of critical scrutiny across time. So, in other words, that's precisely what he needed. Okay, so in other words, it doesn't follow that if the scholarship is strong, therefore it will go against the political. It's not. Tadhana is a very good example where the goodness of scholarship is precisely what the political needed. And let me take you to takeaway number 3. The common idea is that contents determine the political. So the political rests in the content of what we read in the book, what is stated in the book, what is interpreted in the book. But it might, I showed in my book that it's not like that, as demonstrated by cases in these 2 projects. Let me give you an example. Like, for example, this one. The first book of Tadhana is about the formation, the rock formation, the formation of from Big Bang all the way to the formation of the archipelago. Okay, so it's about very technical discussion of geology, the rock formation, and you would think, what politics indeed can there be in rock formation? How can a very technical discussion of geological formation of the Philippine archipelago be political? So that's one thing. But if you take a look at how that volume fits within the overall design, and I hope I have more time, but I don't have enough time to discuss the historiography of Tadhana. But one thing about historiography of Tadhana that stood out is the indigeneity, the indigenousness, going back to the true Filipino, centuries before the coming of Spaniards. And so the rock within this big frame, the rock formation provided that kind of support the idea of authenticity, because the Philippine nation and the people in this country, this particular archipelago, they had in contact with the environment, and this environment was formed by the geological process. So their identity is deeply rooted into the deepest past as possible, down to the geological time. So one of the interviewees, one of the participants, for example, he said, so long as I work on topics centuries far removed from the Marcos years, such as the pre-Hispanic or Spanish period, I am politically safe. No one can say that I sold my soul to Marcos. That's what he said, and I quote. But if you take a look at the whole, okay, at the whole frame of Tadhana project, even if you are dealing with pre-Hispanic period or the Hispanic period, centuries away from the Marcos years, the very idea that Marcos wanted the indigenous kind of history that will support his political project, you, even if you don't like to be implicated, you are already implicated. Because, as I mentioned there, the political is not determined by the content. The political is determined instead by the context of how actual knowledge is used. Okay? It's the context of how knowledge is actually used that decides what is political. It is not the content. So you see there, for example, within the pages of Tadhana, nobody took seriously the innovative approach, the ideas, the indigenous, all this kind of thing. But once it was taken out of Tadhana and developed like as pantayong pananaw, psikolohiyang Pilipino, it gained respectability and acceptance. So it's the same idea, more or less the same idea, but it was on a different context. So the same thing with the highly technical discussion of rock formation I was talking about earlier. It is totally, we can say it's not political, it's just science, it's just geology, and yet once it is placed within the entire structure of Tadhana, it becomes political. So that's another important takeaway from the book. Okay, so takeaway number 4. Okay, so these two projects, they provide that kind of political legitimation. And it's, if we just go by the conventional approach, we're just going to criticize those who participated, and we say that they are not morally strong enough to resist the temptation, so they allow themselves to be co-opted. So that's the usual thing that we're gonna do. But if we ask a different question, okay, like for example, why do you need scholarly history for political legitimation? What does it mean that Marcos and Suharto, they are some of the most powerful dictators who lived in the 20th century? Why do they need history? What does it mean that they needed a scholarly history to do it? So that's the question that we have to ask. And once we ask that kind of question, then things will be taught differently. Okay? So what this will highlight the point that scholarship and scholars, they have their own power that even the most powerful dictators don't have. And if that is the case, okay, if that is the case, if they have this kind of power, they have that kind of power that even dictators don't have, and actually Marcos envied the historians. Okay, so what the other side of Marcos' distrust of historian is envy. Okay, so historians, the ability to write history and that kind of history that will be considered as truthful, that's one thing that he wanted to have. And that's the reason why he wanted to appropriate to act like to be considered as a historian. So if that is the case, okay, why it has to be hidden as why scholarship is often viewed as non-political or anti-political? If scholarship and scholars have actually that kind of power, and if you have that kind of power,
Therefore, it must be political. Why is it that they like to be seen as non-political or anti-political? Again, I go back to what I said earlier. It's precisely because the power, the importance of history, the importance of history in a society. I mean, the importance of scholarship, not just history, but scholarship in general in society, rests precisely on the idea that they're not political. So their power rests on the idea that they are not political. And if people will see that they are political, then the scholarly community will lose that kind of power. That is their fear. Okay, that is their fear. And political leaders will also no longer be happy to just use politicized scholars, because even political leaders, they like the idea that there is this notion of objectivity and impartiality, because their power is enhanced by the objective, by the truth. So political leaders wouldn't also like the idea that these scholars are partisan. The reason why Marcos wanted very strong scholars, well-known, those who were trained overseas, some of the best in their field, is precisely because Marcos believed in the importance of objective or impartial knowledge. That kind of knowledge that may be equated to truth, what is truthful. Okay, finally, the final takeaway that I'd like to discuss today. We knowledge, official history like Tadhana in Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, we often see them as an exception. They happen only once in a while. Okay, that's our idea. Okay, that's our idea. And one of the reasons why they are criticized very badly is one of the reasons why they're being criticized very badly is they are made to set as an exception. We are being made to believe that official histories are exceptions. This happens because certain scholars are not good enough. Okay, they are not morally strong enough to resist the temptation. Okay, so they are made to seem like an exception, and this kind of tendency to push official history as an exception is also shown in the fact that scholars who joined in this kind of project were often criticized, given all this kind of negative labels like intellectual prostitutes and academic mercenaries. Actually, I argued in the book, one thing that I argued in the book is they are not really exceptions. They may be the norm. Okay? They may be the norms rather than the exception. What official histories does is to make explicit, what is happening on day-to-day basis between every individual or group who use particular knowledge. Okay? So what happens is, by making this kind of things explicit, okay, so the reason why scholars like this were called intellectual prostitutes or academic mercenaries is precisely because of the danger that they will expose the well-kept secret within the scholarly community. That in reality, on day-to-day basis, everyone is using any knowledge that they considered as useful for them. Whether it is true or not, whether it is accurate or not, whether it is scholarly or not, people are choosing from the marketplace of idea any knowledge that they would like to use. So when there is a project like official history and scholars willingly do it, okay, it becomes some kind of scandal for fellow scholars. Because how come you would make it explicit, this kind of partnership with people like, particularly with Marcos or Suharto? How can you? But in reality, what they have done in serving the powerful is just formalizing, making explicit what is happening on day-to-day basis. Everyone, this kind of partnership between knowledge and power is happening on day-to-day basis. Whether you are rich or you are poor, that's happening. Wherein you will need some kind of knowledge to validate yourself. So you will pick from the marketplace of knowledge available there. So that kind of partnership between knowledge and power, that's happening on a day-to-day basis. And when official history, something like this happens, it just merely makes it very explicit. And that's what makes it scandalous to other scholars and other politicians who don't agree with them. But if these politicians, for example, they themselves are using scholars, okay? So any politicians, whether you are rightist, leftist, centrist, they resort to the use of scholars. They have this kind of partnership with scholars. So it's happening on day-to-day basis. But because these people in Tadhana joined Marcos and people in Sejarah Nasional Indonesia joined the project, that makes things explicit. And that undermines the power of scholarly community because it makes this thing kind of explicit, and that's the reason why they're being kicked out of the moral universe of scholars by calling them intellectual prostitutes or academic mercenaries. Okay, so I'd like to conclude. This will be the last thing. So I emphasized the primacy of context, okay, rather than content. Context, and we know that, particularly historians, we are very keen about historicism. Historicism is all about context. The problem is the tendency among not just historians, but other scholars to limit the kind of context that they would like to allow. They don't push the logic of contextuality to its conclusion. They will allow the context, they will recognize the context only to a certain extent. Nothing beyond the extent that will undermine their power as scholars. So that's the reason why the anxiety towards relativism is very common among scholars. To a certain degree, they will allow some form of relativism, but beyond that point, they will put a stop. Okay, even if it is philosophically speaking, we can say that practically all knowledge is subjective knowledge, and the reason for that is knowledge cannot exist out of the mind, and only human beings have the mind. Therefore, all knowledge, whether it is true or not, is a subjective knowledge because there is a subject who knows. Okay? There is a subject who knows. The very idea of objective knowledge, that is something out there, is virtually an impossibility. But even if we recognize that we're going to take subjectivity and relativism only to a certain degree. Okay? Only to a certain degree. And when we talk about this kind of idea of being impartial and objective, and our scholarship is supposed to be impartial, if not really objective, this is actually not a neutral position. That is the wellspring of the power of scholars and scholarship. The power of scholars and scholarship rests on the idea that things can be objective, that things can be impartial. Okay, so that is the wellspring of their power. That is, in other words, the very basis of their politics. Okay, so finally, the last point I'd like to make. Okay, so towards the end of my book, in the conclusion there, I argued for the need to rethink, to reorient progressive scholarship. Actually, that book was written because of my deep-seated anxiety towards what progressive scholarship has become. And by progressive scholarship, I mean here the kind of scholarship that that is pro people, pro common good, okay, pro marginalized, and one of the main tenor in this kind of progressive scholarship, it's within this idea of critical tradition. The idea is to critique. Okay, the idea is to critique. And when you critique, you offer an alternative to what you are criticizing. Okay? Now, in my view, if the idea is to help the common people with the knowledge that we produce, critique is not enough. It might not be the one that they need. For most people, criticism of certain thing is not very useful for them. What is useful for common people is how will they be helped? How will they be helped in choosing what kind of knowledge will most likely empower them? Okay? And when you do this kind of critique, and we can see this kind of tradition, for example, in post-colonial theory, in decolonial theory, in post-structuralism, okay? So they came up with a critique, and this kind of critique can only be understood within the community of scholars. Supposedly, this kind of critique is meant to help the common people. But what happens is scholars are just talking among themselves. They take a look at what happens to the development of this kind of critical theory. They are so highfalutin, high-level philosophy and political theory and all that common people can hardly understand them. Okay? So if the idea of progressive scholarship is to truly help the common people, the marginalized, we have to come up, rather than just criticizing, we have to come up with some kind of what I call cartography of knowledge power relations. Cartography, the mapping out of power knowledge relation. So what do I mean by this? It will require lengthy time to explain, and I don't have that kind of time. So what I'm just going to do is just very briefly, the idea in cartography of power knowledge relation is to map out, the basic question to answer is not whether knowledge is accurate or not. because in so much of our scholarship, the tendency among scholars is to keep on debating what is theoretically better, what is methodologically more precise, what is empirically more defensible. So in other words, we are stuck up in accuracy. Okay, accuracy is not the idea in cartography of knowledge. The idea in cartography of knowledge is to describe, okay, the who uses particular knowledge, for what particular purpose it is being used, how it affects the people, okay, how it affects the people, what kind of impact it would have on them, in what particular context, okay, in what particular context such impact will have that kind of impact on them. So mapping out will be a dynamic description of how knowledge changes in a different context, in a particular way it is being used by certain groups, okay, towards what group, okay. So when we have this kind of mapping out, then people will know that, oh, this kind of knowledge claim will be favorable for that group, but not for me. It will be favorable for me, but not for others. So I'm going to choose this. So that kind of knowledge is the one that common people really needs. Okay, that kind of mapping out of knowledge, how it's going to be useful for one particular group, in what particular context, in what particular time. So that is the idea of the cartography of knowledge that I am proposing that progressive scholarship take. And that is the point. On that point, I'd like to end this talk. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for going beyond the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rommel Curaming, for bringing us into the psyche of those who are in power and into the psyche also of those who are writing history. And for reminding us that it's not enough to criticize. It's also important to empower the people, whom we are waking up. At this point, I have so many aha moments during the lecture. It is really very scholarly. And remember the book, Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. Very hot from the press, copyrighted 2020. Routledge, yes, sir. At this point, we are lucky to have a reactor for today. Allow me to introduce our reactor. He is the current program lead for history, and he is serving as professional lecturer at the University of Santo Tomas Graduate School. He is a writer, a veritable writer in culture and history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Antonio C. Hila.
Thank you very much and good morning. First of all, I would like to say hi to a long lost colleague, Dr. Curaming. You know, if it were another speaker, I would have turned down the invitation. But it is a pleasure to be a reactor to his talk. Well, first of all, the book was written so nicely and it absorbed my intention. I sought a copy from him and he sent it all the way from Brunei last year. Well, Dr. Curaming was a colleague at the Department of History of the La Salle University some years back. And on a personal note, I stood as sponsor to his wedding some time ago also. So this is this is quite a reunion for both of us because I have not seen him for quite a long time. Well, to start with, at the outset, I'd like to say that the book is an absorbing study on the mutual relationship of power and knowledge, where power, in the context of Dr. Curaming's work, is of political nature and knowledge is historical. If knowledge is power, its reverse, power is knowledge, is likewise true. This tells us thus that these two big words which Michel Foucault had fastidiously written about assume a mutual relationship. This truism is intelligently pursued by Dr. Curaming in his work, which he applies in the discourse on the Philippines and Indonesia. My discussion, however, is only focused on the Philippines. The setting of the discourse is the martial law period, where then President Marcos assumed vast constitutional authority, or simply put, power. Such a power allowed President Marcos to pursue his, quote, deep personal interest in history, unquote, to commission a historical work such as the Tadhana. Marcos was the talk of town among nationalists, if I recall, the time. Historians, as well as students of history in 1965, when he said in his State of the Nation address that under his leadership, I quote, this nation will be great again, unquote. This was a catchy, if not an intriguing statement for, as compared to other Southeast Asian or Asian countries, the Philippines has no moment of greatness typified by colossal monuments or temples, such as, for example, the Borobudur Temple, the Taj Mahal, or the Great Wall. It was obvious then that the president had made reference to the revolutionary period, whom the late Claro Recto earlier dubbed as, I quote, the finest hour, unquote, of our history. Revolution being the expression of a united front, the collective will of the people, and their quest for independence. Thus, in the early 70s, the birth of the monumental projects such as the writing of the Tadhana, which Dr. Curaming said was a multi-volume work, was conceived. It was conceived to cover the history of the country from the pre-colonial years to the new society. The project would engage the expertise of some of the country's erudite historians, linguists, art historians, and the like. Apart from the president's burning interest in history, Dr. Curaming has cited other considerations for the motives in the pursuance of such a gigantic project that lists, among others, quote, personal aggrandizement, unquote, prestige, nationalism, and as a vehicle for President Marcos to explain himself and the declaration of martial law. In sum, he says, Dr. Curaming says, that the partnership between President Marcos and the writers was made possible, sustained by mutual needs such as financial, political, intellectual, and even psychological. Be that as it may, Tadhana has become then the vehicle for the country's leading historians and scholars to express their divergent views that have collectively enriched the scope of historical coverage and brought enriched understanding that has benefited Philippine historiography, making it alive and kicking, so to speak. It is to the credit of Dr. Curaming that he has woven into a solid scholarly manner the divergent views of these Tadhana writers, whose erudite knowledge have widened and enriched the texture and substance of Philippine history. The prehistoric and pre-colonial origins of the country, for instance, had taken a radical broad sweep assigned to Dr. Su Salazar of the Pantayong Pananaw fame. It became the vehicle for Dr. Salazar to express the novel view that the Philippines served, I quote, an inviolable position of possible intermediate staging point of the epic peopling of the Austronesian world, a feat in itself that asserts what Dr. Curaming says, an affinity and equality of the early Filipinos with the rest of the Austronesians, and more specifically, the Malayo-Polynesians. A new concept of periodization then was arrived at that called for the assertion of the idea that the development of the indigenous nation state concept is, I quote, traced long before the coming of the Spaniards, unquote. There was a novel concept, this was a novel concept, that rather than be seen as a contradiction, is regarded as an expansion of the historiographic view that democratizes the participation of the entire Filipino people in their quest for becoming a nation, which previously was only relegated to those who fought and overthrew the Spanish colonial power. Thus, Tadhana posits the view that becoming a nation could have been attained even without colonization, as, I quote, the conflicts of forces operative within the broader regional context was sufficient to complete the transformative process, unquote. This view was echoed by President Marcos by saying that the colonial state enlarged itself on the foundation of the ethnic states such as the barangay, upon which, I quote, the colonial state enlarged itself. It was through this barangay that the new society resurrected, upon which the government or state was laid upon. Clearly, then, the barangay in the new society was a resurrection of that basic political unit that until today exists. Its basic political relevance was all the more emphasized when, on New Year's Day in 1974, the avant-garde composer, national artist for music, Jose Maceda, was commissioned by no less than then First Lady Imelda Marcos to write a composition that would serve as a vehicle for the promotion of social integration among community residents in the barangays. The composition was dubbed Ugnayan, that embodied the new society's, I quote, advocacy of a united front of forging a strong unity to achieve national progress. At the same time, providing an auspicious moment for listening to the pristine beauty of ethnic rhythm, unquote. Throngs of people carrying their radios gathered within a radius of 100 kilometers in the parks, community centers, and plazas around Metro Manila and 6 central Luzon provinces to listen to the music that was previously taped and broadcast simultaneously on 20 different radio stations. Thus, the continuity of the remote past in the new society is forged and affirmed. Of significant interest too is the fusion of the Ilustrado and the masses in the revolution against Spain that Dr. Curaming highlighted in his study. He says, and I quote, rather than pitting one against another, Tadhana opted to combine the masses and elitist elements as necessary ingredients of the revolution. Rather than a manifestation of class struggle, it was presented as an expression of the national community. Apropos, Dr. Curaming continues, and I quote, in Marcos' own assessment, the need for national identity, unity, and self-determination is among the principal national problems that must be addressed in any governmental efforts, including the writing of history. In the end, Dr. Curaming viewed tadhana was a quest for a higher degree of sophistication in Philippine historiographic scholarship. Viewed largely as a political propaganda, only a handful individuals out of the Tadhana circle had appreciated its scholarly value. Although lately, he says, there are signs that the legacies of Marcos, including some works attributed to him, are being resuscitated. It is from this consideration that the word tadhana, or destiny, find its appropriation as the word affirms the truism that history is destiny. Dr. Curaming cogently had posited the idea that from the standpoint of history, tadhana was both a reaction and an accommodation. It is a reaction to the myriad problems that confronted Philippine historiography, and as an accommodating move, I quote Dr. Curaming, framed its narrative within the long familiar nationalist anti-colonial templates, unquote. All told, Dr. Curaming posits the view that the scholarship or knowledge and politics or power are not necessarily oppositional. Undoubtedly, intellectual expertise is in itself power. Thus, the adage, knowledge is power, as I had earlier pointed out. Political power ensures the attainment of a scholarly historical knowledge. The pursuit of their mutuality or fusion, to my mind, has eloquently been pursued by Dr. Curaming's recent pioneering study that altogether has expanded the dynamic frontiers of our very own Philippine historiography. It is in this regard that Dr. Rommel Curaming's eloquent study on the Tadhana assumes primordial significance and utmost importance. Truly, a glorious contribution to contemporary Philippine historiography. Congratulations, Dr. Curaming. Thank you.
I totally agree, Dr. Hila. Truly a glorious contribution. Thank you very much, Dr. Antonio Hila, for that very comprehensive, very equally scholarly reaction. And may we encourage our viewers for today to post questions. Take advantage of the time while our guest resource speaker is here, Dr. Romel Corami. Okay, so they noticed that there are no questions, Doc Romel, and indeed that was a very uh, deep lecture. I was curious though, how did you come up with the decision to write about that topic? What made you decide to choose that particular moment of history to write about?
Okay, thank you. Sir Hila, thank you very much for your reaction. I'm really happy to see you again after so long. How many years was that? That was wow, that's crazy. 20 years. Um, I look forward to meeting you again at some point in the future. Okay, thank you, Attorney, for your question. Actually, yeah, yeah, that made me think how indeed I managed to arrive at this kind of topic. Actually, I used to be a high school teacher. I was teaching history initially at Colegio San Agustin, and then moved to Philippine Science High School. So my experience as a teacher of history, I that in that already immersed me in the politics of history, historical knowledge. So as early as that time, I was teaching particularly Asian history, and if you're teaching Asian civilization, you considering how Eurocentric considering how Eurocentric our views are, and you're teaching Asian civilizations, you easily see that kind of disjuncture between the dominant view and yeah, how should Asian civilization be understood? So I think my interest in politics of historical knowledge started from my experience as a teacher, and also I also dived into textbook writing during the time, so Philippine history, for example, and it was very, yeah, at UP, studying at UP, so it's a very political. My because I grew up in the province, and my idea of Philippine history and other world history is the one that was written by Gregorio Saide. And then so what? The first moment you step into UP, the first thing that they will tell you is to unlearn whatever kind of history, Zaide history that you have learned. So those moments, yeah, highlighted the deeply political nature of knowledge. And then when I first started to be exposed to Indonesia, because you see, truth be told, I I find Philippine history disheartening. So the one reason why I took refuge in Asian history is I can see that kind of upward trajectory. For example, Chinese or Japanese, that kind of history that can go up. Okay, they went down, but they're going up. So during the time, Philippine history for me is one story of pain after another, and because of that, I got more interested in Asian history, and when I start, so I had I my interest in Philippine history was not really that strong. But when I started to be exposed to Indonesian history, that's when I realized how fascinating Philippine history is. So when I began seeing it from the standpoint of Southeast Asian and particularly Indonesian history, I realized how fascinating Philippine history. So my interest in Philippine history got rekindled, and once I got to know about the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, I also have heard quite a lot of stories about the Tadhana project. So I thought, probably, how about I do some kind of comparison of these two and take a look at the politics of historical knowledge production as evident in these two projects. So that's how it started.
Yes, yes, Doc. Exactly. A beautiful background story because uh, I have also read a lot about Tadhana in the past and the controversies behind it. We have a question from our viewers. Yeah, it's from Rona Mel de los Reyes from Abalacat City College. How will Tadhana study be relevant in today's time? Thank you very much, Rona.
Oh, thank you very much, Rona, for that question. Actually, um, I the most important thing about Tadhana, as Dr. Hila very well emphasized, is the emphasis on the indigenous. And because for so long, that emphasis on the indigenous actually resonate today. With the rise of, we have been talking about populism, okay? Populism by Trump, by Duterte, or all those populist leaders. And we're seeing the rise of various populist initiatives or expression of populism. And this kind of idea of populism is often looked down upon. They are considered as irrational, emotional. So they are being looked down upon, and they are being pushed aside or set aside or ignored. But the recent, you see the recent rise of even more populist energies in various parts of the world, it seems that it's no longer can be kept to that level, okay? Unlike before. And I think the development of social media technology has much to do with this. So with people having access to social media, allowing them to express themselves, so the avenue for self-expression has been greatly expanded. And and so you see the populist feelings that has been pushed down for so long, that allows that kind of outlet. And the emphasis on the indigenous actually is it's well connected to the populist. Okay, in a way that we have to pay attention to what real people on the ground are thinking. Okay, so for so long we have been emphasizing, for example, this guy, we have been following the West trajectory of the development, for example, of the Western civilization, modernization theory. We're following this kind of path. But perhaps for most people, they don't really like that. But a minority of people had been pushing us on this direction. But other people, common people on the ground, they're saying that no, this is what we just like a simple life. We just like this kind of life. We don't like that kind of life. So the impulses of populism on what I'm trying to say here is the populist impulses is these are rooted in the suppression of the indigenous. That because we have been too civilized, we have been too westernized, we have been ignoring. But it's about time that we pay more attention to what real people on the ground are saying, because the logic of indigeneity might be operative on that level. Yeah, thank you.
Ongoing pa.
Yeah.
We have one more question from our audience, from our viewers. From Kyle Vergara. I am Kyle Vergara, a student from the UST Graduate School. It is clear to me that the liberal view of power-knowledge relations is the dominant strain in the academe. How can we go about changing this? How do we remove the understanding of knowledge production and consumption from its liberal moorings? I know that your book is an attempt at kickstarting discussions about this, but how can we introduce this to the classroom?
Thank you very much, Kyle. Yeah, it's a very good question. You you hit the heart of the matter here. Actually, it's really sorry. You're right that the liberal view is pervasive in the academe and the society, at least the hegemonic part of the society. Okay, so and we can easily understand that kind of hegemony because that is favorable for them. Okay, now it's favorable for the political economic elites, and it's favorable for the intellectual elites. That kind of liberal view. Um, this idea of liberal view presupposes the idea that the more knowledge you have, the more intellectual you are, the better you're able to understand things, and the better that you'll be able to propose certain solutions to the problem. So this it's it's uh, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. That we reject altogether this kind of intellectualist. Yeah, we have reached this point. We have reached this level of development. true intellectual achievements that we have. But it's also about time that we take a break, take a look at it very intently. To what extent really there might be this kind of intellectualism might really be resulting in certain negative things. It's not all about the goodness. Okay, so one of the things I emphasize in the book is that knowledge, we have to get away with the idea that to know is a fundamental good. We have to accept the possibility that to know may be good or bad, depending on the context of how knowledge is used. And I amply demonstrate in the book this kind of, in what particular context it would be not good for whom, and in what particular context it would be okay. So because the dominance of the liberal view, yeah, presupposes the idea that to know is a fundamental good. The Enlightenment tradition, we associate knowledge with enlightenment. And the very idea of enlightenment is yeah, it's light. So if you don't know, you are in the dark. You're supposed to know. So that's the reason why you have light. And that's easy to understand why it became very easy for us modern human beings to accept knowledge, to equate knowledge with what is good. But in reality, okay, in reality, to know can also be bad, and that's one thing that we have to very well emphasize. So we have to look, for example, into the primacy of the intellectualist bias that we have. It is an intellectualist bias. We normally don't pay attention to it because we have taken it as something natural. Okay, we have taken it as something natural that we know, we study, therefore we know more, therefore we have this kind of greater understanding of things. And because we know more and we understand more, then we're better off. We have already, right from the moment we were born and then we started kindergarten and all, this has been imbibed in us, and it has been naturalized that to know is good. Okay, but that's the reason why it makes it very difficult for us to pay attention to the other possibility. Okay, the possibility, we keep on laughing, for example, with the saying that ignorance is bliss. So that's the opposite of the knowledge is good. But if we take a look at it, perhaps there's a truth in in that saying that ignorance is bliss. Unless we accept that kind of possibility, we will always be blinded by our faith in knowledge. Sometimes there is some kind of moments in our life that we don't have to know, and it's okay. Sometimes to be ignorant, not to know certain things is fine. So it's difficult for us intellectuals, those who are studying PhDs, those who are lecturers, because this will mean undermining the very basis of our power. The very basis of our power as scholars is to know. Okay, and that's make your question that makes it difficult to answer is precisely because it will entail so much looking within ourselves. Okay, and being humble about things. Okay, about the possibility that the main source of our power might also be one of the major sources of our problem in the society. But unless we realize that, we will not be able to start teaching our students about this duality, okay, these two phases, and they have to know really that yeah, it's not too bad. There are instances it's not really too bad to be ignorant. I think that's on that point. I would like to end my answer. Thank you very much again for that excellent question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rommel Curaming. Oops, it's almost time. We could have entertained more questions, but that would be the last for this lecture. And to present the certificate of appreciation let us all once again call Dr. Antonio Hila and the chair of the UST Department of History, Dr. Archie Resos.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rommel. Talagang masasabi ko, tinadhana ng Diyos na magkita tayo because we were students from UP Asian Center under the mentorship of the late Dr. Aurora Rojas Lim, Benito Lim, the great minds Eileen S.P. Babiera and Asiri Abubakar. Wala na sila ngayon, but in behalf of the University of Santo Tomas Department of History, I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Rommel Curaming, our Senior Assistant Professor of History and International Studies Program of the University Brunei Darussalam. Thank you for sharing your wisdom for our UST Department of History's 11th webinar with your exposition about your book titled Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia, State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. As a token of appreciation, I will allow Attorney Donesa to read the Certificate of Appreciation for your great contribution in the field of scholarly research in history. Maraming salamat, sir. Terima kasih.
Thank you. Thanks.
The Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas Faculty of Arts and Letters, Department of History, award this Certificate of Appreciation to Dr. Rommel A. Curaming for being the resource speaker in the UST Department of History 11th webinar in discussing his book entitled Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines, held online 7th December 2021, signed Associate Professor Archie B. Resos, PhD, Chair, Department of History, and Professor Marilu R. Madronio, PhD, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Letters, and of course, witnessed by Dr. Antonio C. Hila. And we will also like to present Certificate of Appreciation to Professor Antonio C. Hila, PhD, for being the reactor in the UST Department of History 11th webinar on Dr. Rommel Curaming's book entitled Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines, held online 7th December 2021. Signed, Associate Professor Archie B. Resos, PhD, Chair, Department of History, and Professor Marilu R. Madronio, PhD, Dean, Faculty of Arts and Letters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Resos, Dr. Anton Hila, and Dr. Curaming.
Salamat. Thank you. See you again, Dr. Curaming.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Thank you.
See you again. Yeah.
So today, indeed, is a very happy day. We have a very, very erudite scholar who talked to us about the usefulness of history for policy making and history as a tool for personal glorification of those who are in power, and history as a social control, because the fear of history never escapes us. History is always a better judge. And our erudite scholar, Dr. Rommel Curaming, also informed us that it is the actual use of knowledge that makes it political. And indeed, history is a tool for in many climes of the world. History has been used for political legitimacy. So once again, thank you to all our viewers for the registered participants to receive your certificate of participation in this event. The Secretariat will send the link for evaluation in today's webinar through your respective emails. By accomplishing it, the certificate will be emailed to you. To end our program this morning, please join us. But before that, To end our program this morning, please join us in singing the AB hymn and the UST hymn. Muli, magandang araw po sa inyong lahat.
Carved from the mighty rock of faith, shaped by traditions of old, steered by God's guiding hands towards farther shores of our dreams. Faithful vessel on the high seas, searching undaunted and free. Sunlit decks ring with voices resounding in one hymn of praise. Life long and Lord brimming full, tempered by His gentle hand. The seas lucent blue in a distant white, the mind's strong reason in the heart's delight. We are lovers of beauty, seekers after truth.